I'd like to try something a little different, a little new with this particular project. Mainly because I've been bored and frustrated with the way that I've been working for a little while now. There's been this itch, this persistent thing. So I wanted to try moving in a little different direction, making some of the implicit ideas in the way that I work a little more explicit. A, because I think that would be more valuable for you guys listening in, and B, it would help me get a better understanding of it too, simply to talk through and better articulate some of these ideas. So even as I'm sitting down to get started with this project, I've got a bit of anxiety creeping in. And I had whole lessons laid out, I had whole lectures kind of outlined in my head, but then this anxiety popped up and I thought, well, let's just, rather than stick with a particular script of how things ought to go, let's maybe work with what's actually present. Go figure, that's a key rule of the work itself. So if we look at anxiety, it might be interesting to take a look at what the word itself even means, where it comes from, right? There's this idea, I think it was Aristotle, who said something that he who sees things from the beginning has the best view of them. So let's get a better view of anxiety, right? Seems pretty useful if we're going to embark on any creative endeavor, any risky endeavor, any entrepreneurial endeavor, any bold or courageous endeavor. It seems like anxiety is part and parcel with that. And rather than banish it altogether, probably a little better to make use of it in a more effective way, if we in fact can do that. So if we look at where even the word anxiety comes from, its Latin root is this word ango angere, and I'm kind of lucky in that I spent 5 years studying Latin when I was a kid. So this word ango angere basically means to draw or to tighten or to choke off in some way, even when it's referring to the throat. And it's funny, even as I'm talking through this with you guys here, I can sense this little constriction, this drawing in my throat. It's kind of funny, right? The world of embodied awareness oftentimes is a double-edged sword, because then you're so intimately connected with all of the body's little subtle responses of things that it can be, quite frankly, a pain in the ass a lot of the time. But of course, noticing these things gives us a chance to work with them. So this anxiety, it's an embodied experience all on its own, right? This narrowing of things, this drawing in, this choking off. We can look at it on one hand as an embodied experience, and on the other we can look at it as this more abstract, more philosophical idea too. And what I'd like to do in this particular project is dance back and forth between those two poles. What I'd like to attempt is to make some of these abstract ideas more concrete in embodied experience. And of course, as we go through each of these little episodes, little scenarios, whatever we want to call them, I'd like to give you a number of embodied practices to concretize some of those abstract ideas. But of course, the beautiful thing about us as a species is that we're able to make the concrete abstract as well. We're able to take lessons from a particular domain and draw them out. We're able to get them out of the reified state and apply them in a broader set of domains. So I think there's real value in making the abstract concrete and the ability to make the concrete abstract, to see, well, how many different domains can we apply this idea to? You can see even now this is kind of a heady work in progress, but bear with me. I think we're going to make something out of this. So this anxiety, let's look at it in an embodied experience first and foremost, right? It's worth keeping in mind that any embodied experience occurs within a context, right? There's a situation at hand which is part and parcel with my experience of anxiety recording this little lesson. And what's funny is that even as I talk through this, that experience is diminishing quite a bit. So maybe there's a meta lesson there for us too. But this embodied experience is taking place in a context. So we might zoom out and then say, well, what's the context in which anxiety crops up? And for you, where is it that you notice anxiety in your life? Is it in artistic endeavors? Is it in social situations? Is it when you have to give a speech or a performance? Is it, as you're thinking about starting a new direction in business, what's going on? Like, what are the obvious things taking place that are part and parcel with your embodied experience of anxiety? It's really worth taking a look at that too, because you might find, for example, that maybe you're anxious because you haven't had any protein on a given day. Maybe your body is just literally like primed for anxiety. Worth taking a look at. Like, have you eaten recently? Have you eaten well recently? Have you slept well? Like, all of these things. If we take a look at almost an anthropological study of you as this embodied organism, what's obvious about the way you're living your life? I mean, one of the examples that I guide nearly every client of mine through is this thought exercise, and you might follow along with it too, where if you imagine a little bird on the windowsill looking in at you every day, all day, what does that little bird see taking place? I mean, if we take it from this objective lens, we can check some of our inherent biases in favor of ourselves or against ourselves, and we can zoom out to get a little bit more of an objective lens. Of course, it's not totally objective, right? We're never going to have a perfectly detached eye of ourselves, but from what you can imagine, right here and right now at least, what does that little bird see every single day? I mean, even up to this point in the day, what has that little bird seen you do throughout the day? With whom has that little bird seen you do all of these various things? And I would encourage you to stick with what is obvious at this particular point. There's no need to untangle all of the archaeology of your life quite yet, anything like that. It's probably a story for another day, but for the time being, what's obvious about the way you live your life? About the schedules, the routines, the habits, the behaviors, about the obvious manifestations of you smacking into the world around you, of you taking part and engaging in the world around you. What's the obvious stuff there? Now, that context has a lot to do with your experience, right? Because go figure, if I weren't recording this right now, I wouldn't be in this situation that apparently is somewhat anxiety-provoking for me, yeah? So, it's a good reflection for me. I chose to put myself in this situation. That's bringing up a bit of anxiety, yeah? So it's also worth knowing that I could turn the recording off, I could turn the camera off, and I could get rid of this anxiety altogether. So really obvious check-in with yourself. Like, this situation that's bringing up all this anxiety, is this something you're doing to yourself? Like, what kind of role do you have to play in your experience of anxiety? And oh my God, even just talking through that, like, I can really find my voice. This constriction that was there at the start, it's dissipating to some degree. Even just articulating this experience. So there is incredible value in you articulating your experience of these things. So with that said, we've got this contextual lens of anxiety, yeah? Let's zoom in a bit more. What's your embodied experience of this anxiety? If you're coming up against anxiety, how is it for you? Like, how is it making itself known to you within your experience? As I hinted at earlier, this anxiety, for me, it was this kind of clenching around the throat. And I noticed a little band here as well, right around the level of my diaphragm. And go figure, these are really common places where people experience anxiety, yeah? But of course, these aren't necessarily the only places. But if we look at that root, ango angere, meaning to draw or to bind or to choke, in your experience of anxiety, where are you binding yourself? Where do you feel bound or constricted or drawn in some way? It's worth bringing awareness to this, because the moment you have awareness of where it is, you have awareness of what it is, and you have awareness of how it's taking place, you can do something about it. So if I have this sense that my experience of anxiety sort of making itself known in an embodied sense through this constriction around my throat, this constriction around my diaphragm, a really useful strategy is to try and just take ownership of that. So if I don't say, like, there's a constriction here, like if I stop objectifying and reifying myself, if I stop making a thing out of my experience of myself, if I reclaim some sense of the process of it, I can find a way out. So rather than say, there's a constriction here, I can say, well, for example, I'm constricting myself. I'm bracing my throat. I'm clenching my diaphragm. I'm holding myself here. And even talking through that, even bringing awareness to that, there's this release that takes place, at least momentarily, yeah? I notice even as I'm talking through it, for example, that something again has changed in the quality of my voice. Something has really changed in just the quality of ease I feel in breathing at this point too. So again, now that you have this contextual, this sort of situational lens of your anxiety, and you have this embodied experience of this anxiety, what's different? Right? We learn through differences. When we can bring these things to our awareness, and we can notice change over time, well, we learn from that, yeah? And so when we learn, we can adjust our behavior. We can change the way in which we do the things we do. And so, yeah, even as I'm talking with you now, I'm noticing like I'm involving more of myself in this. Like I'm quite literally loosening up a bit, yeah? So again, these embodied metaphors are there for a reason. Like we know what it means for someone to be uptight, yeah? Someone who's uptight has a certain way about them. And when someone says that word, uptight, we know what they mean. Like we know how that person carries themselves. We know something about the way they act. But when someone loosens up, like when they lighten up a bit, yeah? Again, that embodied metaphor speaks volumes. Like the way that I am now, even engaging in this little process, is very different than the way I started this. Like I'm in touch with a bit more vitality, even talking through this stuff now than I was at the start. At the start, it was a little in my head. It was a little analytical. It was talking about the experience of anxiety and talking about it rather than fully experiencing it, yeah? Now, it's worth maybe bringing in here, too. Fritz Perls, the sort of developer of Gestalt psychotherapy and one of the leading thinkers in the Gestalt school, had this idea that anxiety is basically excitement without the breath, yeah? So when we constrict, when we draw in, when we bind ourselves, even just related to our breath, that's very anxiety provoking, yeah? When we brace and cut off and choke off that breath, we suppress something. And sometimes that's useful. It's not to say that suppression is a bad thing. Maybe you're suppressing an emotional experience you can't yet quite cope with. And if you can't cope with it, well, of course you want to tamp that down. But it's also worth knowing that you might be able to cope with more than you realize. Like clearly in this experience, just as one small example, I can cope with the process of talking kind of a free-form thing into a camera, into a microphone. I can cope with this. Whereas before, at the start of this experience, something in me had the sense that I couldn't yet cope. So go figure, when we bring awareness to these things, again, they change our experience of these things. So, with that said, whenever you are experiencing this anxiety, where is it that you're bracing yourself? And I wonder, what are you afraid of experiencing on the other side of that? Is it failure? Is it looking like an idiot? Is it not making something worthwhile or meaningful? Is it loss? Is it, any number of things? And truth be told, you don't necessarily need to unpack the why behind the anxiety. That's not the most effective thing. I mean, go figure. There are a zillion reasons to be anxious. You had too many cups of coffee, the looming threat of climate collapse, of terrorism, of economic, fall apart, whatever. You could be anxious for any number of reasons, yeah? Getting out of bed can be inherently anxiety provoking because go figure. There are a lot of things to be anxious about. But what do? Choke yourself off even more? Draw yourself into an even tighter ball? Cocoon yourself even more? I mean, maybe, but it's worth asking, How's that working out for you? Like, is that more or less of the way you'd like to experience yourself in the world? Again, your answer is entirely your own. I know my answer in this particular context is that, wow, it's a lot easier to be myself. Like, I quite enjoy this way of being with you as you're watching this or listening to this or whatever the hell you're doing here. I quite enjoy this more than I was at the start. I'm having a lot more fun with it. The pressure's off. Like, I'm able to riff with a bit more ease. Like, that's the thing about anxiety, is that it's almost an attempt to end gain a particular outcome. Like, the things that we get most anxious about, quite often it's like the things that we want to go in a particular way. Like, if you're dealing with social anxiety, for example, maybe it's because you don't know how to cope with all of the nuance of another person, or, God forbid, all of the nuance within yourself. So you play this role, and you've got this kind of contrived mask, yeah? This default robotic compulsive programming. And you try and fit that other person into a box too, and then go figure, the anxiety mounts and mounts because at some point something within you knows that that game is going to break in some sense, yeah? Like, anxiety is fundamentally a way to avoid dealing with all of the complexity of the world around us because, for whatever reason, we don't yet know how to cope with that complexity. Or look at stage fright as another example. You want that performance to go a particular way. You've got this idea, this narrow little idea of what the favorable outcome would be, let alone all the favorable outcomes that you can't even predict, yeah? Anxiety is fundamentally, it's a constriction into the known and the familiar and the comfortable at the expense of all of the benefit of the unknown and new and unfamiliar, right? Like, all the growth that we want in the world comes when we mobilize our anxiety and not constrict away from the world, but grow out into it. Now, maybe we talk in another episode or another, I don't know whether they call these episodes or what, but we could talk about depression as another embodied experience, right? Because there's a time to cocoon and to withdraw and to pull in. But something about anxiety, it's like there's this constriction of this mounting energy that you feel, right? If you breathe into that, if you practice constricting even further into it or releasing that constriction, you find this mounting excitement, right? So go figure. That excitement helps you engage with the world. It helps you mobilize something new within yourself. It helps you actually create in a truly generative way. I mean, as, again, sort of a meta example, feels kind of weird to look at it from this lens, but when I first sat down to record this, I didn't quite expect that we would be talking about this or talking about it in this way, but now that I'm here, it's like, hell yeah, this is way better than what I had envisioned. Like, all of my anxiety was because I was trying to end gain a particular outcome. I wanted to, project a particular way. I wanted to fit this within some predictable mold, and fuck it. That clearly didn't work. But as I got in tune with this embodied experience of anxiety, as I started to sit with that experience and not deliberately try to change it, but just be with myself as I experience anxiety, rather than talk about that, as I got into the experience of it, something about that shifted. And go figure, I think this is a little bit better than what I had planned originally. So we might take a look at how we could apply this moving forward here too. Now, anxiety is an embodied experience of the meaning of the word itself, right? It's a constricting, it's a drawing in, it's a choking off. Now, what does it choke off? Well, we draw in our musculature within certain areas of the body. We engage parts of ourselves to choke things off. What are we choking off? Well, maybe a feeling that we don't want to feel. Maybe a movement that would be inappropriate to make. Maybe a possibility that we don't yet know how to cope with. Like anxiety, it's an adaptive response. Maladaptive in some situations, but it's adaptive. It's useful a lot of the time. But not when it controls us. Not when we give up agency of it. Not when we cede the authorship of our own story of anxiety, right? When we experience and reclaim our ownership of anxiety, it becomes something incredibly useful, right? We don't have to be bound anymore when we realize that we are the ones binding ourselves. And when you know that you are binding yourself, and you know how you are binding yourself, well, go figure. At the very least, you could stop binding yourself. Yeah? So it's fascinating how these things play out when we get deeply attuned with our embodied experience, when we really unpack some of these metaphors that we just toss around. Like this connection between movement and metaphor, between language and embodied experience, it is profound. It's how we know ourselves on a concrete level and an abstract level. And so for you, I wonder, what do you hope to gain from this? If you're dealing with anxiety, what are the situations in which you find yourself most anxious? And how do you experience that anxiety? Where within yourself do you feel that constriction, that drawing in? And can you get a sense that it's you doing that? That maybe you are the one constricting, you are the one binding, you are the one choking off. And what would it be like to stop? Not to blow yourself open or break your heart open or any of these cliche things, but what would it be like simply to stop that binding? To decontract those tissues, right? It's a very different experience if you've got a clenched fist. It's very different to open your fist, yeah? Or, if you're clenching, to simply decontract and to release that clenching. It's a very different experience from opening up. Maybe opening up exposes you to more risk than you can handle right now. But it might also be the case that this decontraction creates just the bit of breathing room you need to think creatively, to think generatively, to think in a more human way about whatever it is that you're up against. So, with all of that said, feels like a pretty good place to wrap for now. I'm not sure what this will turn into down the road, what directions we're going to take, but I'd love to explore this connection between movement and metaphor more and more and more, and give you guys a conceptual framework for this, give you the tools to explore your own experience. Like that's magic when we get into it. So with that, I hope you've enjoyed. If you have questions or comments, be in touch. I don't know if this will be a video or an audio or an email, but let me know. I'd love to engage with this more and get a sense of what this brought up for you. So shoot me a message and let's keep the exploration alive.